Thanks so much. Good to see everyone here, and I see some of my students, but a lot of people that haven't been in classes and speakers talking about this, so I don't know everybody's knowledge and following the issue, but obviously it is one of those areas where sports has bled over into the news, and ultimately that may be a lot of what this is about. You have people that don't want news in their sports. They just want sports as their refuge. They want sports as the place they can go where they don't have to worry about these kind of things. And you hear that in a lot of conversation around this issue. But whether we like it or not, sports is a microcosm of all that's going on in society, and this is exactly what's happening here. So to set the stage, we started about 15 months ago. It was a preseason game, San Francisco 49ers, and what people don't know is in the first two preseason games, now I'm talking about the third preseason games, in the first two preseason games, quarterback Colin Kaepernick had been sitting for the national anthem. He was hurt, he was not dressed in uniform, no one noticed. It was never a story. The third game, he was in uniform, he was ready to play, and he sat during the national anthem. It was asked about in the locker room. He talked about protesting police brutality, protesting what had recently happened in this country with injustices, and it became an issue. And it became a firestorm. And it became something that, as I said, bled over into news events, bled over into not just being talked about on ESPN, but being talked about on CNN, on MSNBC, on Fox. And that's what has happened again and again over the last 15 months. Everything, as we know as lawyers, is policy and precedent. So what did the NFL do when this happened, when this firestorm erupted? Well, as we know, social media dominates everything. Twitter, as we know, our tweeter-in-chief, Twitter, the NFL tweeted within an hour after the Kaepernick sitting their policy. And it was out there right away on social media. And basically, the tweet said, players are encouraged, but not required, to stand for the anthem. And once they tweeted that, that's it. That's the policy. That's what everyone, millions of people could see, and that's what we had. What that means and has meant is there has been no discipline for kneeling, for sitting. And by the way, Colin Kaepernick reverted from sitting to kneeling starting the next week after talking with a friend of his in the military, thought it was more respectful to kneel than sit. And that has been the take of the knee has really enveloped out of that when Colin Kaepernick moved from there. So what has happened since? As we know, Colin Kaepernick, the genesis of this entire take a knee movement, is still unemployed. He has not signed with teams. He's been a free agent since February. Many, many quarterbacks have signed. We can all have debates on this guy's better than Kaepernick or not as good as Kaepernick, all of that. We're actually in the middle of a collusion lawsuit by Colin Kaepernick against the NFL for a collusive effort not to sign him. I think that's an uphill climb. That's another topic. But I think the conversation that Dean Alexander wants to start here is, where are we on this issue? Where are we in terms of take a knee, player protests, players using their collective voice as a First Amendment, as an expression that has upset a lot of people, including, of course, the president. We are in a unique time in sports where players are exercising their voice in a way they haven't before. I know we've had the Muhammad Ali experience, we've had other players in the past, but as recent as 10, 15, 20 years ago, athletes really didn't engage in this area. This was not their expertise, this was not what they wanted to do. And it just seems like when Colin Kaepernick took a knee in a preseason game that no one would care about otherwise, it gave voice. Since that time, we've had NBA players wearing their warm-up jerseys that say Black Lives Matter. We've had LeBron James and his team wear the hoodies after the Trayvon Martin situation. We've had all kinds of subtle and not so subtle efforts by players to express a voice, to support a cause. And they may be the most well-known people of color in the country, so they have a voice, they have power, and they're exercising that power. On the other hand, we have management. I've been management with a team. You're dealing with sponsors, you're dealing with fans, you're dealing with networks, you're dealing with constituencies that, as I started, just want to stick to sports. And you have NFL owners meeting this week saying, this is hurting our business. What do we do? So there's a balance that ownership, management, and sports has to come to about their employees, where they want to support them. They realize players are the product. They realize players move the needle. But they also realize it's bad for business. Fans are turning away. Sponsors are making inquiries about this. Networks are moving away from showing the anthem because they just don't want that as part of their broadcast anymore. So we're in a unique time, and this is the discussion that's going on. Trying to straddle that fence between supporting employees who have this right. Okay, there were meetings this week. They did not come out with a resolution that we are going to make them stand. They did not. Instead, they met with them. They talked about their issues. And the last thing I'll say before I open it up is the problem now is the issues. It has been conflated with the flag and the anthem. The initial issues that Colin Kaepernick took a knee for were issues of injustice, issues of racial inequality, issues of police brutality. It has now been conflated with the flag and the anthem and patriotism and military, and everything just seems to be mucked up. And of course, all fueled by tweets from the Oval Office. So we have all of this in play here. To me, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating conversation. Obviously, we talked about it in class, and I'll just open it up. If anyone wants to add to it or start the conversation, which will continue, as Dean said, over the next 10, 15 days. Anyone want to chime in? Yes, ma'am.
How many professional teams actually employ the national anthem before they begin play? NHL and when did it begin for basketball, baseball, and football? And why? I'm curious.
I don't know the full answer to that, but as long as I've been going to games as a kid, I've always remembered the anthem. I do think there was an aspect to it that emphasized more military and law enforcement in the past 5 or 6 years. I believe it was 2011. And there was an article that did not put the NFL in a good light, where it started talking about there were payments made from the Defense Department to have more of a pomp and circumstance to the anthem. But that's relatively new. I do think the anthem has always been something that played at sporting events. That issue right there, and since 2001 with 9/11, we've had a much different look at the anthem, much more pulling out the flag across the field, much more military-based police, fire, law enforcement. So the anthem has always been played, as I understand it, but not with this sort of level of engagement patriotically.
It has always been.
As far as I can remember. Yes, sir. Yeah, I mean, I think this cuts across divisions in all sports. You do have NBA and NFL, much more African-American based sports in terms of the players. In terms of the fan base, you do see more of a reaction from NFL fans, more of a negative reaction than you do with NBA. I will say this, the NBA has been more progressive on a lot of issues. Their commissioner, Adam Silver, seems more player-friendly, but the NBA has a rule that does require standing. The NFL does not. Maybe it's just a discrepancy that has existed all this time. No one's really thought about it until now when we have this issue. But the NBA, you'll notice the players will lock arms, the players will wear shirts, but they do not kneel. They do not take a knee, and probably because they have a harmonious relationship with management. That's the rule, and it's allowed. And I would include the WNBA in that as well. They've been as progressive and initiated protests earlier than the men. Yes, ma'am.
Kind of along those same lines, do you think it makes a difference because football is an American sport as opposed to basketball on an international level? And also to that, kneeling in football, that's a response to a fallen player, and a player who's injured. It's also kind of something that you see more commonly here. You don't generally see basketball players who drop on the field. So do you think that the sport that we're talking about also kind of, if we speak specifically to football now, do you think that that makes a difference at all?
You know, I think the knee concept you talk about, you see it more in football. I think you see it more with injured players and respect in any sport. You know, my kid's soccer game, you saw it the other night with the NBA when Gordon Hayward got a grotesque injury. I do think the NBA, the NFL, because it's bigger. It's bigger than anything. It gets more coverage than anything. It dominates Sunday lifestyles more than anything. Anything associated with the NBA is going to get more attention. Anything with the the NFL is going to get more attention just because it's the NFL. And again, the president seems to be fueling this every time it seems to be dying down. Another tweet. Yes, Sean.
So I'm asking, what's this bound in the sense that if it wasn't this issue, it'd be something else? Because the NFL is largely American revolution. It's not the that's the kind of like this is good. Because in the side of it, how much is
Yeah, the question was, it was maybe just a matter of time before the NFL becomes politicized. And I think you're right. I just think that, I mean, having covered the NFL for so long and been in it, it's almost like it seems too big to fail. And I think deep down, maybe some other leagues, wish the president was tweeting about them, whether good or bad. This kind of attention, and after the year of the Ray Rice video, ratings went up. And after all the Tom Brady shenanigans in court with deflated footballs, ratings went up. It's just like the more conversation, in some ways, as you say, the better. It just continues to flow, and everybody's talking about this, not only in sports, but everywhere. And as Dean said, the shows I've been on this week have not been ESPN. They've been MSNBC and CNN and those kind of things. That's what people want to talk about. So yes, I think politics and sports has always had this kind of dance, and now the dance is closer than ever. Yes?
Where do you see this movement going in sports? NBA season taking off, and NFL players becoming more vocal, that people are not making this, and other players try to combat this.
Right.
What do you think is next? Will you start to take action, will players become involved in holidays, stuff like that?
Yeah, I think the question is what's next, and is there an end game? And this is a question I hear a lot from people, like, well, these players, what are they doing? Where do they stand? They don't really have a message. What's next? What's the end game? And I think we have to see that. I think sometimes there isn't a clear end game, and that's okay. You've mentioned Malcolm Jenkins from the Eagles. He has been to Capitol Hill several times with colleagues from the NFL talking about criminal justice reform and mass incarceration and all these sort of social justice issues that you don't really see from players. Now, players have a power. They can get these meetings on Capitol Hill. They sat with owners this week. There's a letter from Roger Goodell and Doug Baldwin, a player for the Seattle Seahawks, co-signed to the senators supporting criminal justice reform. That wouldn't have happened, I think, but for Colin Kaepernick. I don't think that would have happened. So where does this power go? Maybe more things like that. Maybe players and owners have a little more symbiosis. Maybe they don't fight as much because the players need the owners' clout. The owners need the players' support. We'll see where it goes. I think NBA, as you said, is starting now, and obviously they may be the most powerful players at all, especially the star players of the NBA. If they take these similar stances, I think we could see a different endgame where, whether it's legislative, congressional, all these things we talk about. Yes?
This is kind of stemming from that question, but slightly different in the sense of what do you think Colin Kaepernick's endgame is? As you mentioned earlier, the NFL leadership and owners and players all met. It was argued that there were substantive things that come out of the movement thus far, to which he was invited and chose not to attend, and also around the same period chose to bring up this lawsuit, which seemingly is just very hard to prove. So what do you believe Colin Kaepernick is trying to get out of this at the very end?
Yeah, Colin Kaepernick's become a focus of all this as a player that is not even playing. And I think he filed, as I mentioned, a collusion grievance, and I think he's just frustrated. He just saw his last straw was, I talked to his lawyer, the Tennessee Titans had an injury and brought in 6 quarterbacks, and he wasn't one of them. And I think this was a frustration. And again, they are trying to have an implicit actor in this lawsuit be the president. So we'll see where that goes. I think that's an uphill climb. I think you're not going to find a communication between 2 actors saying, let's not sign Colin Kaepernick. He wants to play. He wants to play. He really does. He knows that this is not a good way to try to play with the collusion grievance, but I think he's just, using that as potential leverage, like, you sign me, I'll drop the grievance. But I just note, he will be noted in 50 years, 100 years, in a sports law class taught in 100 years, as someone who kind of started this, whatever you want to call it, this movement, this change, this empowerment for athletes. Even as someone who's out on the outside now, even as someone who's outside looking in, because he did this. And again, it's the power of the NFL, it's the power of players, it's social media, it's this constant drumbeat about what's next in the NFL. And it really has overtaken a lot of conversation. We're not talking about the games as much. We're talking about this. Couple more. And again, I reiterate what Dean Alexander said, this is continuing over the next time period. Any others? In the back, in the red? Yeah.
Saying that you need to appear as equal. I'm just wondering what you think about that perspective. I personally think kind of go with it through it. At that meeting doesn't change the dynamic necessarily. I still think the owners are still the employers and the players are still the employees. So I don't see only positive in them coming together, trying to understand like the motives.
Yeah, this is new. This is new. This is 75, 80, 90-year-old owners, and they're being told, come sit with these players. And as you mentioned in class, we talked about some of these owners sitting out that part of the meeting. Jerry Jones of the Cowboys as one of them. And they just felt like, we're not sure we're ready to sort of sit at the table as equals. And you have to understand the history of sports, as we talk about all the time, the leverage has always been tilted towards ownership. and still is. So when you have a meeting and you're saying we're going to have this conference table and you're going to sit there with 23-year-old players and you're going to have a conversation, that didn't go over well with everyone. Now, some of them, the owner of the 49ers, Jed York, John Mara of the Giants, some of these were like, okay, yeah, let's have this conversation. Let's be equals. Let's break it down. Let's get real. But others are like, no. So within ownership itself, and I've heard this is going on in the NBA as well, where they're like, we've got to get everyone on board on that side too. Now, what you haven't mentioned is the players. We would be naive to think all players are in this same thinking here. And we saw a little bit about with the Steelers, and they stayed in the locker room, and Villanova came out alone, and later Ben Roethlisberger felt sorry for him. And there's going to be internal divisions, if there hasn't been already, I've heard there has, about teams. And that's something I worry about, because sports is all about teamwork. And if you have internal divisions about this issue, are you going to be on the same page on the field and in practice and in meetings and everything else? And I'm not really even talking racially. I'm just talking all these different players from different parts of the world, different mindsets. Are they all on the same page on this? I worry about that. Yes. I think so, and I'm going to defer to other experts in future meetings about high school sports and what you can do as a jurisdiction. High school-wise, what would you like to answer? Process.
So the first point is on the substance, actually, that there are going to be different questions when it's a state-sponsored mandate. So there absolutely will be a different take, and I think that's an interesting aspect of this, that there's also a labor and employment law aspect. If you say you have to stand, then that's your contract. How do you deal with that? But if the state is requiring you to do some action, then that does actually raise First Amendment issues. The process answer is, hopefully, as we have our smaller group conversations, that's one of the things we want to have breakouts on, to start to explore that in greater depth. Because there actually is, there's a lot of questions about what the responsibility would be, or the response would be if there was a state action. So there is actually, the state requiring you to take a certain action would have an implication on your First Amendment rights.
And one of the speakers we had here last year, right after this happened with Kaepernick, was Preston Brown, a coach over in Camden, who was having his entire team take a knee and continued it throughout the season. And again, faced a lot of racial epithets, faced a lot of criticism, and stood in the face of it. So again, this is a divisive issue. I get it. We have two here. First, Carrie.
Well, one thing that I feel is really getting lost in all this, which is the big, like even in this whole discussion, like literally, Corey went on Colin Kaepernick, was mentioned once, and I feel that there is an underlying sentiment that has an issue not even with the flag, but the sentiment behind the protest. Like when Jerry Jones and then Neil before the anthem, it was still food. Not during the anthem or anything. I was wondering from your perspective if you heard any of that with the actual sentiment behind it.
Well, as I said, yeah, I think everyone is sort of asking, why are they doing this? And as you said, Colin Kaepernick was very clear. It was very clear, and other players have been as well. But somehow it's against the flag, somehow it's against the country, somehow it's against, like I keep saying, this idea that sports is pure and shouldn't be cluttered with all this real world stuff. I think that the message is out there, certainly with players, but as you said, somehow when you talk about the larger media, the larger scope, people are looking at this as anti-American. And I know that's frustrating to you and frustrating to a lot of people. Doris.
And go owners, players. So, low-key question that Black Lives Matter because located there, you've got certain fractures. Located where they don't respect life. Right now, everybody's trying to hold fractures among the players themselves. They're not fans, they're not the different NBA is different from NFL, the owners are different. I didn't see this. Where's it go? Where's it start?
Well, I think, as Kyrie said, not enough is being made of this or that. I just mentioned a couple tangibilities. I mentioned a letter from a Seahawks player and Roger Goodell supporting certain legislation. I mentioned visits from Malcolm Jenkins and other NFL players to congressmen, several trips to Capitol Hill. I mentioned owners and players sitting down as equals. I think it's hard to sort of say where it's going, but you have to compliment where it is. These things haven't happened. I went to owners' meetings for 10 years. I never saw a player there, ever. Never saw a player at an owners' meeting. That's happening now. And the last thing, Adam Silver or Gary Bettman of the NHL or Rob Manfred of the MLB, Major League Baseball, they don't want to be shamed by other commissioners, other sports leagues. So I think it will continue. And maybe it brings players and owners into more of a symbiotic relationship where things get done like that. You have Chris Long of the Eagles just donated his entire salary. $1,000,000-something. That doesn't happen. So I just, you try to look at this from a optimistic viewpoint rather than what about the divisions. I think there's some healing going on between two sides that have had some distrust. Yeah.
I think kind of going back to that point of getting away from Kaepernick's original message, it allows fans, it allows those of us who are on the outside of the game, it allows owners, it allows everyone to say, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but you can't. It lets everyone say, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but I don't want to sit at the table with my employees. It kind of provides that, that I don't even know what you call it, like an outlet, like it lets you run off. So we're going this way, and I'm gonna start this way. Yeah, that's okay, that's true, that's right, that's fine. But I'm gonna go here. And I think in our discussions, it's important for us, and this is kind of my charge to my peers and to that in these discussions, it's important not to take those out. Don't look at it and say, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but what about the white? Yeah, Black Lives Matter, but what about those soldiers who give their lives for it? I don't want to say that it's not about that, but it's just not about that. That's not what we're talking about right now. I understand the concern for it. I understand that it's an issue, but that's not what we need to be talking about.
I think this makes people uncomfortable, and I think that's not bad. Change only happens outside comfort zones. And that's what seems to be going on in sports right now. We've crossed the Rubicon with sports. I don't think we can see it as just the comic pages anymore. It's got real life issues, real world issues, and it seems to be the forum for people's expressions these days. Terrence.
So just piggybacking on the last three comments, I think it is important to note that not only are they taking lead, a lot of them have gone into their communities. They've done fundraisers to add training that these officers receive in their town. So to Sam's point, maybe it's not deflecting with some of the more on what actually is being done. So it's not just Red Ball and Rodney Goodell sending letters and Malcolm Jenkins going to the White House. They're actually doing work on the ground level, grassroots, going out and making sure that the initial issue, the division between the police departments and the areas that they're policing and the quote-unquote fear of who they have to protect and serve is actually being addressed. So I guess my question to everyone is everything else just a smokescreen? Is the product actually doing bad? You just mentioned 2 examples of the last time we saw issues, ratings went up. And while there are people returning season tickets and not going to games, are there not more viewers every time we know there's going to be a protest during the national anthem? Even in London, we all got up extra early just to watch the Jaguars, who we probably none of us in here like or can name 11 players on their 53-man roster, but we all got up to see Khan and his players arm in arm, or we watched to see if the Giants, and then we're going to watch to see if Jerry Jones benches anyone. Ratings are going to go up. So at what point does it stop being about cap, stop being about players, stop being an employment issue? And this is just all smoke and mirrors about getting the product over since the ratings have been down since the presidential election.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think going off Sam's and Derek's point, I think 10, 15 years from now, what's the narrative that we're going to be looking back at this? Is this the police brutality issue that Colin Kaepernick wanted to address? Or is this going to be looked at as a flag or anthem protest that divided America even more? When we're supposed to just be shedding light on the issues that have to be every single day across communities all across America. And it's really important that we don't lose that message that we've been talking about, but how can we relay that to people who are of different opinions, backgrounds, cultures, anything like that?
As we also know, nothing happens in a vacuum. We've got a divisive, polarizing atmosphere in this country right now, and that's being reflected in sports as well. And again, Kaepernick has not signed, Kaepernick has not spoken. He's become this sort of figure with that. I covered a rally in New York at the NFL offices for Colin Kaepernick. Thousands of people showed up. And football was never discussed. So we obviously see there's a movement there. In the back. Yeah, the comment was about, putting the athletes, especially black athletes, in their place with people not wanting to engage this. And I think that's another part of our discussion as we go forward. There is this sort of stick to sports is subtle, meaning is really, we don't want to hear from you on this stuff. We just want you to play. So I think with that, we'll put this on hold for the next time, which there will be many of them coming up soon. Thank you guys. Thanks for coming.